The courtroom in Nuremberg was cold that November morning in 1946. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood in the dock, shoulders back, uniform stripped of insignia. His face showed nothing. 73 years of Prussian discipline had taught him that much. The American prosecutor held up a document, statistical abstract from the Eastern Front, Operation Bagration, June through August 1944. 350,000 German soldiers killed or captured in 6 weeks. 28 divisions destroyed. 400 kilometers of front collapsed. The greatest military defeat in German history. The prosecutor's voice echoed off the marble walls. Field Marshal Keitel, you signed the orders establishing the fortress city policy. You knew these garrisons would be encircled and annihilated. Yet you signed anyway. Why? Keitel's answer came without hesitation. I was following orders from the Führer. The words hung in the air. Simple. Absolute. Final. 27 years later. In a modest suburban home in Northern Virginia, a retired schoolteacher watched that same footage on PBS. The documentary was called The Wehrmacht on Trial. Heinrich Müller was 51 years old, gray at the temples, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked like any other high school history teacher in America, except for the scars. One ran from his left ear to his jawline. Another disappeared under his collar. His right hand was missing 2 fingers. The interviewer, a young man with long hair and a notebook, sat across from him. Mr. Müller, you were there. Operation Bagration. You survived when most of your unit didn't. The question everyone asks is simple. How did Germany lose so badly? Müller watched Keitel on the television screen, watched the field marshal's face show nothing as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Death by hanging. Müller turned off the television. That's the wrong question, he said. The question isn't how Germany lost Operation Bagration. The question is why professional officers allowed the system that made Bagration inevitable. He stood and walked to his bookshelf, pulled down a leather journal. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting cramped. I kept this during the war, against regulations. If they'd found it, I would have been shot. I kept it anyway, because someone needed to remember the truth. He opened to the first page. The date read June 10th, 1944. This is where it started, Müller said. 2 weeks before the Soviets attacked. 2 weeks before everything fell apart. This is the day I understood that duty and suicide are not the same thing. This is the day the system revealed itself. The command structure of Army Group Center in the summer of 1944 was a study in contradiction. On paper, it looked professional. General Ernst Wagner commanded from his headquarters near Minsk, 58 years old, career officer since 1908. He had studied under the best minds in the Prussian military tradition. He understood maneuver warfare. He understood elastic defense. He understood how to trade space for time, how to preserve forces, how to inflict maximum casualties while minimizing his own. Wagner was good at his job. That was his tragedy. Below him, the command structure descended through corps and divisions and regiments. Officers who had learned their trade in the trenches of the First World War. Men who understood that warfare was mathematics. You calculated force ratios. You analyzed logistics. You studied terrain. You made decisions based on reality. Then there was the other command structure, the one that mattered. Hitler sat 1,500 kilometers away in the Bavarian Alps, in a compound called the Berghof, surrounded by maps and telephones and yes-men. He had never commanded so much as a company in combat. His military experience consisted of 4 years as a corporal in the First World War, running messages in the trenches. He believed this qualified him to command 3 million men across 2,000 kilometers of front, and the system said he was right. Between Hitler and Wagner stood 2 more layers. The Army High Command, the Armed Forces High Command, generals and field marshals and staff officers whose job was to translate Hitler's ideology into military reality. They couldn't. So they tried to translate military reality into terms Hitler would accept. They failed at that too. General Kurt Brenner, chief of the Army General Staff, sat in his office in East Prussia and stared at the intelligence reports. They arrived every 6 hours. Updated estimates of Soviet strength opposite Army Group Center. 2.3 million men. 5,200 tanks. 36,000 artillery pieces. The numbers kept growing. Brenner had served for 34 years. He had fought in the First World War. He had studied at the War Academy. He had commanded troops in Poland, in France. In the early days of Russia, he understood what these numbers meant. They meant Army Group Center was going to be destroyed. He had been telling Hitler this for 3 months. Hitler had stopped listening 2 months ago. Brenner's hands shook as he signed his name to another situation report. Nervous exhaustion. The doctors called it 3 years of arguing with Hitler. 3 years of watching predictions come true. 3 years of being ignored. He was 56 years old and looked 70. His chief of staff found him that way, staring at the wall, hands trembling. "Sir, General Wagner is requesting permission to fly to Berghof. He wants to present his defensive plans directly to the Führer." Brenner laughed. It was not a happy sound. Wagner still believes in the chain of command. Wagner still believes that facts matter. Wagner still believes that professional military judgment will be respected. Should I tell him not to go? No. Let him learn. We all had to learn. Lieutenant Heinrich Müller was 22 years old and already tired of war. He had enlisted in 1941, volunteered, believed the speeches about defending the fatherland. He had survived Stalingrad by luck and by learning to recognize the sound of incoming artillery 3 seconds before anyone else. That 3 seconds had saved his life twice. He had been wounded twice, once in the leg, once in the shoulder. Both times he had recovered and been sent back to the front because Germany was running out of officers. Now he commanded a platoon near Vitebsk. 38 men, most of them 18 or 19 years old, boys who had been in school when he was fighting at Stalingrad. They called him lieutenant. They looked at him like he was ancient and wise. He was 22. The platoon was dug in along a low ridge overlooking a river valley. Good defensive terrain, clear fields of fire, multiple fallback positions. If they were allowed to fight mobile defense, they could hold this sector with half their current strength and inflict 3-to-1 casualties on any assault. But they weren't allowed to fight mobile defense. They were ordered to hold the forward positions. No retreat. No elastic defense. Hold every meter of ground. Muller sat in his dugout that evening and wrote a letter he would never send. His younger brother, Karl, was 17, still in school, soon to be drafted. The letter began, June 10, 1944. "Karl, I'm writing this so someone knows the truth. I won't send it because the censors would stop it, and I'd be shot for defeatism. But I need to write it anyway. We're digging in for the spring. Command says the Soviets will attack south toward the oil fields. Every briefing, every intelligence report, same story. The Soviets always go for the oil. Obvious strategic objective. But I count their artillery positions every night. I use binoculars after dark and watch their muzzle flashes during registration fire. They're not concentrating south. They're concentrating here, right across from us. I've reported this up the chain. Every night. Battalion knows. Division knows. I assume Corps knows. I assume Army Group knows. Nothing changes. We're still ordered to hold these forward positions. No fallback lines prepared. No mobile reserves positioned. Just dig in and hold. Is this duty or is this suicide? I don't know anymore. Your brother? Heinrich." He folded the letter and put it in his journal. He had been keeping the journal for 6 months. Against regulations. Punishable by court-martial. He kept it anyway because someone needed to remember. Across the river valley, 3 kilometers away, Soviet artillery positions were being reinforced. Muller watched through his binoculars, counted the guns, made notes. 112 heavy guns in one sector alone. He reported it that night. Battalion acknowledged the report. Nothing changed. General Ernst Wagner's aircraft touched down at Berchtesgaden on June 15th. He had requested this meeting 3 weeks earlier, been delayed twice, finally approved. He carried a leather briefcase containing intelligence summaries, force disposition maps, and 3 defensive plans. Each plan assumed different levels of Soviet strength. Each plan required permission to establish fallback positions and create mobile reserves. He was kept waiting for 2 days. The Berghof was not a military headquarters. It was a mountain retreat. Picture windows overlooking the Alps, paintings on the walls, the smell of fresh flowers and furniture polish. Staff officers walked quietly through carpeted hallways. Wagner stayed in a guest room and waited. On June 17th, he was summoned. The conference room was large and bright. Maps covered one wall. Hitler stood at the map, studying the Western Front. Normandy. The Allied landings were 2 weeks old. This was what concerned him. Wagner entered and saluted. Hitler turned, smiled. The smile never reached his eyes. "General Wagner, you've come from Army Group Center." "Yes, my Führer. I have intelligence summaries and defensive plans that require your approval." Hitler gestured to a chair. "Sit. Tell me about the situation in Belarusia." Wagner remained standing. Professional habit. Officers reported standing. "My Führer, our intelligence indicates massive Soviet concentrations opposite our positions. We estimate 2.3 million men, 5,000 tanks, 36,000 artillery pieces. The concentration suggests a major offensive is imminent." Hitler nodded, still smiling. The Soviets always mass their forces before offensive operations. "This is standard." "Yes, my Führer, but the scale is unprecedented, and the concentration is focused on our center, not on the southern approaches to the oil fields." The smile faded slightly. "Your intelligence suggests the Soviets will attack north, not south toward the oil." "Yes, my Führer. This contradicts every analysis from the high command. The Soviets need oil. They will attack toward the Romanian fields. This is obvious." Wagner opened his briefcase, pulled out maps and intelligence summaries. "If I may show you the reconnaissance data." Hitler held up his hand. "General Wagner, I understand you are concerned about your sector. This is natural. Every commander believes his sector faces the greatest threat. But strategy requires seeing the whole picture, not just one front." Wagner kept his voice level. "My Führer, I am not overestimating the threat. If anything, our intelligence may underestimate Soviet strength. I'm requesting permission to establish fallback positions and create mobile reserves. This would allow us to respond to—" "No." The word fell like a blade. Hitler walked to the map, pointed at Vitebsk, at Orsha, at Mogilev. "These positions will be held. I have designated them fortress cities. They will anchor your defensive line. They will tie down Soviet forces. They will disrupt enemy logistics. My Führer, if I may explain the tactical situation." "The tactical situation is clear. The Soviets will attack. Your forces will hold. Fortress cities do not retreat. This conversation is over." Wagner stood holding his briefcase, maps and plans still inside, unused. The meeting had lasted 17 minutes. Hitler had spoken for 13 of them. Wagner saluted and left the room. That evening, alone in his quarters, he wrote a letter to his wife. The letter was never found after the war, but his aide remembered him writing it, remembered the words Wagner had said aloud as he wrote, "I have commanded 400,000 men to their graves, and he wouldn't listen for 20 minutes. But I will still obey. What does that make me?" The fortress city policy was born from desperation and ideology in equal measure. In the winter of 1943, after the disaster at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht learned that Soviet forces could now encircle and destroy entire German armies. The old certainties were gone. German military superiority was a myth. The question became, how do you defend against an enemy who has learned to break through and drive deep into your rear areas? The professional answer was mobile defense, elastic responses, trade space for time, inflict casualties, preserve your forces. Hitler's answer was different. Hold everything. Designate key cities as fortresses. Garrison them heavily. When the enemy breaks through, these fortresses will remain behind enemy lines like stones in a river. They'll disrupt Soviet logistics, force the Soviets to detach troops to contain them, buy time for counterattacks. On paper, in Hitler's world of maps and ideology, it made sense. In reality, it was murder. General Kurt Brenner had explained this in conference after conference. My Führer, fortress cities only work if mobile reserves can relieve them. We don't have mobile reserves. These garrisons will be encircled and destroyed. Hitler's response never varied. The fortresses will tie down enemy forces. Dead men tie down nothing. My Führer. Then the commanders must ensure the men don't die. The fortresses will hold. For Army Group Center, Hitler designated 4 fortress cities. Vitebsk, garrison of 35,000 men under General Friedrich Schneider. Bobruisk, garrison of 40,000 men under General Anton Hartmann. Orsha, garrison of 15,000 men. Mogilev, garrison of 12,000 men, 102,000 men anchored in static positions. General Schneider was 51 years old. He had joined the army in 1913, fought in the First World War and been decorated for bravery. He was not a Nazi. He had never joined the party. He was a professional soldier who followed orders. When told his garrison would defend Vitebsk as a fortress city, he had protested through proper channels. Written reports explaining why this was tactically unsound. Presented alternative defensive plans. All denied. All overruled. Vitebsk will be held. General Hartmann at Bobruisk had done the same. 48 years old. Professional soldier. Not political. He understood that fortress cities without relief forces were simply traps. He protested. He was overruled. Bobruisk will be held. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed every order. He was chief of the Armed Forces High Command, 62 years old. He had spent more time managing paperwork than commanding troops, but he understood military reality. He knew the fortress policy would fail. He signed the orders anyway. Years later, when Muller saw Keitel's testimony at Nuremberg, when he heard Keitel say, "I was following orders," he understood something fundamental about the system. Keitel wasn't lying. Muller told the interviewer in 1973 he was following orders, but he was also facilitating murder. He knew the fortress policy was suicidal. He had the authority to argue against it. He had the authority to resign. He chose to do neither. He chose to sign papers that killed 100,000 men. That's not following orders. That's enabling them. Across the river valley from Muller's platoon, Senior Sergeant Dmitry Volkov studied the German positions through binoculars. Volkov was 23 years old. He had survived the siege of Leningrad. 900 days of starvation and artillery fire. He had learned to spot German positions by the way snow melted differently over dugouts. Had learned to identify different artillery calibers by sound alone. Now he was an artillery spotter for the First Baltic Front. His job was to identify German positions and call in fire. He was very good at his job. Through the binoculars, he watched German soldiers digging trenches. They were professional about it. Good spacing. Proper fields of fire, multiple fighting positions. They're competent, he said to his observer team leader. That'll make it harder. No, that'll make it sadder. They're digging static defenses. Look at the pattern. No fallback positions. No mobile reserves staged behind the line. They're planning to hold ground. Not to maneuver. Maybe their doctrine changed. No, their doctrine is fine. Someone's forcing them to use bad tactics. Volkov lowered the binoculars. He had studied German tactical manuals captured at Stalingrad. The Germans understood mobile defense. They'd proven it for 3 years. This static defense approach wasn't German. This was something else. When we attack, Volkov said, it's going to be a massacre. Behind the German lines, hidden in forests and marshlands, Soviet forces were concentrating. Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded the overall operation. He was the Soviet Union's best operational commander. He had saved Moscow. He had destroyed the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. He understood that victory required more than courage. It required deception, concentration of force, and precise timing. Operation Bagration would demonstrate all three. The deception operation was elaborate. False radio traffic suggested attacks would come in the south, toward the oil fields. Dummy tanks and fake supply depots were built where German reconnaissance could photograph them. Entire fake armies were created on paper. Meanwhile, the real concentration happened in the center, opposite Army Group Center. 36,000 artillery pieces were moved into position at night, camouflaged during the day. Registration fire was conducted in small increments, so the Germans wouldn't realize the full scale of the buildup. 5,200 tanks were staged in forests. 2.3 million men were assembled in multiple echelons, and the date was chosen with calculated symbolism, June 22nd. 3 years to the day after Operation Barbarossa. 3 years since Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. Volkov knew all this. Every man in the artillery knew. The rumors spread through the ranks. This was going to be the big one. This was going to be revenge. On the night of June 20th, Volkov found something in an abandoned German position. A photograph. A German family. Father in uniform. Mother smiling. 3 children, all under 10 years old. He kept the photograph in his pocket. Why? His observer team leader asked. Because I need to remember they're human. When the order comes to fire, I need to be able to fire. But after, I need to remember they were human. War makes monsters of us all. Yes, but we can choose whether to forget that or remember it. Across the valley, Lieutenant Muller was writing another letter he wouldn't send. June 20th, 1944. Carl, I count their positions every night. The numbers keep growing. If I'm right about what I'm seeing, we're outnumbered 20-1 in artillery alone. I've reported this. Battalion knows. Division knows. Corps probably knows. Orders haven't changed. Hold the forward positions. No retreat. I think about General Schneider in Vitebsk. 35,000 men in a static garrison. If the Soviets break through on our flanks, Schneider's garrison will be cut off. Surrounded. No way out. Professional officers have to see this. The math is simple. You don't put a third of your force in static positions unless you have mobile reserves to support them. We don't have mobile reserves, so either the people making decisions don't understand basic tactics, or they do understand and don't care. I don't know which is worse. Your brother, Heinrich, June 23rd, 1944. 4 o'clock in the morning. Muller woke before the barrage. Habit born from Stalingrad. His mind registered danger before his conscious thought caught up. Something was wrong. The night was too quiet. Then the world exploded. 36,000 guns fired simultaneously along a 450-kilometer front. The bombardment was so massive that the concussion wave could be felt 50 kilometers away. Trees splintered, earth geysered into the air. The sound alone was enough to rupture eardrums. Muller's platoon was dug in on the forward slope of a low ridge. Proper military doctrine would have put them on the reverse slope, protected from direct fire. But proper doctrine required fallback positions. They didn't have fallback positions. They had forward positions and orders to hold them. The first salvo of Katyusha rockets hit 300 meters in front of Müller's dugout. The multiple rocket launchers the Germans called Stalin's organs, 32 rockets per launcher. Dozens of launchers firing in unison. The sound was like the world tearing apart. Muller was in a reinforced bunker, logs and earth 2 meters thick overhead, designed to withstand anything short of a direct hit. The concussion from the Katyusha barrage threw him against the wall. He felt his ribs crack, tasted blood. His ears rang so badly he couldn't hear his own voice when he tried to shout. The single electric light went out. In the darkness, he felt the walls crack. Dust filled his lungs. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't hear. He thought, this is how I die. Buried alive while command structure debates, politics, 1,500 kilometers away. The barrage lasted 2 hours. In some sectors, it lasted 4. Muller had survived Stalingrad. He had survived 2 years of Eastern Front combat. He had been wounded twice and thought he was hardened to war. This was different. This wasn't combat. This was annihilation. When the barrage finally lifted at 6:30, Muller crawled out of the bunker. The entrance was partially collapsed. He had to dig through loose earth with his bare hands. Daylight hurt his eyes. The landscape was unrecognizable. His platoon's positions were gone. Simply gone. The trenches had collapsed. The fighting positions had been obliterated. Where there had been trees, there was now open ground scarred with craters. He counted his men, 38 before the barrage. 11 alive now. 3 were so shell-shocked they couldn't stand, just sat in the dirt, rocking back and forth, eyes vacant. He tried the telephone line to battalion headquarters. Dead. He tried the radio. Static. Through the smoke and dust, he saw movement. Soviet infantry. Thousands of them. Advancing in waves behind a wall of tanks. He had 2 machine guns still operational. Perhaps 200 rounds of ammunition total. The mathematics of the situation were simple. He could fight and die in 14 minutes, or he could retreat and be court-martialed for abandoning his position. Professional doctrine said, preserve your forces. Fall back to the next defensive line. Continue the fight. His orders said, hold. He looked at the 11 men still alive. Boys, mostly, 18 and 19 years old, looking at him like he had answers. We're pulling back, he said. Grab the wounded. Leave everything else. It wasn't a hard decision. It was the only decision that made sense. They moved south, using a drainage ditch for cover. Behind them, Soviet forces advanced into positions that no longer existed. The forward German line had simply been erased. Army Group Center was dying, and 1,500 kilometers away, in a comfortable bedroom in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler was asleep. The duty officer at Berghof that morning faced a decision. Reports were coming in from Army Group Center. Heavy Soviet attacks. Multiple breakthroughs. Communications disrupted. It was 4:30 in the morning. Hitler had gone to bed at 4. The duty officer knew Hitler's schedule. Late nights reviewing reports. Conferences that lasted until 3 or 4 in the morning. Sleep until noon. This was the pattern. Hitler had given standing orders not to be disturbed, except for the most critical emergencies. The duty officer looked at the fragmentary reports. Soviet attacks. Heavy fighting. Communications disrupted. Probably a local offensive. Probing attacks. The Soviets did this all the time. Nothing that required waking the Führer. He made his decision. The Führer would be informed at his regular waking time. Hitler rose at 11:45. Bathed. Dressed. Took his medications. Amphetamines from Dr. Morel. Vitamins. Hormone injections. The cocktail that kept him functioning. He ate breakfast alone. Vegetarian meal. No alcohol. No tobacco. He was particular about his health. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 hours after the Soviet barrage began, Hitler was informed that Soviet forces had launched major attacks against Army Group Center. How major? He asked. His military adjutant admitted they didn't know yet. Reports were still coming in. Heavy fighting at Vitebsk. Strong attacks near Orsha. Probing actions along the entire front. Hitler listened, ate his meal, asked if this was the main Soviet offensive or a diversion. The adjutant didn't know. We'll know soon enough. Hitler said, we'll address it at the afternoon conference. The afternoon conference began at 4 o'clock, 12 hours after the barrage began. By then, the true scale of Bagration was becoming clear. Soviet forces had achieved breakthroughs in multiple sectors. 3rd Panzer Army at Vitebsk was being enveloped. 9th Army near Bobruisk faced massive armored assaults. 4th Army's front was crumbling. General Adolf Heusinger, Chief of Operations, presented the situation with maps and casualty estimates. Multiple divisions had lost contact with headquarters. Soviet tank columns were driving deep into German rear areas. Communications were disrupted across the entire Army Group front. General Wagner was requesting permission to withdraw to the Berezina River, a fallback position that could be defended. Hitler's face reddened. Who is requesting this? General Wagner, my Führer, commander of Army Group Center. Hitler slammed his hand on the table. Wagner again. Always Wagner with his retreat proposals. The answer is no. The fortress cities will hold. The line will hold. Commit mobile reserves to seal any breakthroughs. Field Marshal Keitel consulted his notes. The reserves, my Führer. The 12th Panzer Division is in transit from the south. The 20th Panzer Division is refitting near Minsk. The 5th Panzer Division is in Poland. Hitler pointed at the map. Send them all to Army Group Center. Seal the breakthrough. Destroy the Soviet spearheads. The conference lasted 3 hours. Every request for retreat was denied. Every request for flexibility was refused. The fortress cities will hold. The line will hold. General Brenner, still nominally chief of staff, though he had submitted his resignation weeks ago, sat in the conference and said nothing. He had argued for 3 years. No one had listened. No one was listening now. In his journal that night, he wrote, "The army is dying and the man killing it cannot see it, or will not see it. I don't know which is worse. 200 kilometers to the east, Lieutenant Mueller and his 10 survivors were walking through the night, moving west, avoiding roads, hiding from Soviet patrols. They had no food, no water, no idea where German lines were anymore. One of the wounded died during the night. They buried him in a shallow grave and kept moving." Mueller had saved his journal, had kept it in his tunic pocket during the barrage, against regulations, against orders. He kept it because someone needed to remember. That night, hiding in a forest while Soviet tanks rolled past on the road, he wrote by moonlight, June 23, 1944. "Carl, today I learned the difference between duty and suicide. I abandoned my position, saved 10 men instead of dying with 38. I disobeyed orders. I'm either a coward or the only man in my battalion who made the right choice. I don't know which, but I'm alive. 10 men are alive because I chose to retreat. While 1,500 kilometers away, in a comfortable room where the war is maps and numbers and ideology, a man who was asleep while we died made decisions about courage. This is the system. This is what we serve. I don't know what that makes us. Your brother, Heinrich." He closed the journal. Around him, 10 men slept. Boys who had survived because their lieutenant chose disobedience over death. Above, stars wheeled through a clear sky. The war continued, and in the Berghof, where maps showed armies that no longer existed and plans anticipated reserves that would never arrive, Adolf Hitler studied the Eastern Front and was certain that willpower alone could reverse what artillery and ideology had destroyed. Army Group Center had 6 more days before the fortress cities began to fall. 6 more days before the system revealed its final truth. That obedience to evil is not virtue. That duty without conscience is not honor. That following orders is not absolution. The lesson was written in blood across the fields of Belarusia. Some men learned it. Most died before they had the chance. The truck bed was slick with blood. Mueller counted 12 wounded men already packed into the space. Most were unconscious. 2 were crying. 1 stared at the ceiling with eyes that saw nothing. The driver, a corporal from a supply company, gestured for Mueller and his survivors to climb aboard. "Where are you heading?" Mueller asked. "West. That's all I know. Just west." Mueller and his 10 men climbed up. There was barely room. They sat with their backs against the truck sides, legs tangled with wounded men who didn't move. The truck lurched forward, joined a column of vehicles fleeing westward. No organization, no march order, just a stream of trucks and half-tracks and ambulances moving away from the sound of Soviet artillery. The boy next to Mueller was 19. His name was Franz. He'd been in the platoon for 3 weeks. During the barrage, he'd been buried when his fighting position collapsed. Mueller had dug him out with bare hands. Franz was shaking. Couldn't stop. "Lieutenant," he said, "did we hold the line?" Mueller looked at the boy, covered in dirt, eyes wide, desperate for some meaning in what had happened. "Yes," Mueller lied. "You held—" Franz nodded, closed his eyes. The shaking continued, but he seemed calmer. Across from Mueller sat a sergeant from another unit. Older, maybe 30, face gray with fatigue. "Where's your unit?" Mueller asked. "Gone," All of it. We were at Orsha when the barrage hit. I was in the latrine. Only reason I'm alive. When I came out, my company didn't exist anymore. How many made it out? From my company. Just me. But I saw others running. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Nobody knows where the line is anymore. The truck hit a pothole. One of the wounded men screamed. Muller pulled out his journal, held it steady against the truck's movement. Wrote by the fading daylight. June 24th, 1944. Carl, I've met 5 officers today. All tell the same story. We tried to report the Soviet buildup. Intelligence worked perfectly. Every level of command knew what was coming. The information went up the chain. Battalion to division to corps to army group. And then nothing changed. That's what they all say. We reported it. Nothing changed. The chain of command worked. The chain of decision-making was broken. I'm starting to understand something. The system didn't fail because information was bad. It failed because information didn't matter. Someone, somewhere, made decisions based on ideology instead of reality. And we're dying for it. I'm writing this in a truck full of wounded men. Most will die before we reach a field hospital. The ones who survive will be patched up and sent back to the front, to follow more orders from people who don't care if we live or die. Is this duty? Is this honor? I don't know anymore. Your brother? Heinrich. The truck drove through the night, stopped once to refuel. The driver came back with news. Vitebsk is surrounded. 35,000 men, completely cut off. Muller felt something cold settle in his stomach. General Schneider, the entire garrison, trapped. Are they breaking out? The driver shook his head. Orders from the top. There to hold. Relief is coming. What relief? We're all running west. I just drive the truck. Lieutenant, I don't make the decisions. No one does, Muller thought, except the man who never visits the front. Who issues orders from 1,500 kilometers away? Who was asleep while we died? June 25th, 1944. General Friedrich Schneider stood in what had been Vitebsk's city hall and studied the map. The encirclement was complete. Soviet forces had closed the ring 2 days ago. His garrison of 35,000 men now occupied a perimeter roughly 8 kilometers across. Every road out was blocked. Every supply route cut. His chief of staff had just finished the logistics report. 3 days of ammunition at current consumption rates. 1 day of food. Medical supplies are critical. We have 800 wounded and no way to evacuate them. Schneider was 51 years old. He had joined the Kaiser's army in 1913, fought in the trenches of the First World War, been decorated for bravery at Verdun. He was not a Nazi, had never joined the party. He was a professional soldier who believed in duty, honor, and following orders. All his professional training told him the situation was hopeless. All his professional training told him to request permission to break out. He had sent that request 12 hours ago. The response had just arrived. He read it twice, then handed it to his chief of staff. Read it. The chief of staff read aloud. Vitebsk is a fortress city. Fortress cities do not retreat. General Schneider will hold his position and tie down Soviet forces. Relief columns are being organized. The breakout request is denied. Adolf Hitler. Silence in the room. 4 division commanders stood around the map. Professional soldiers. Career officers. Men who understood what this order meant. Colonel Werner spoke first. He was 42, had commanded a regiment through 3 years of Eastern Front combat. Sir, with respect, this order is militarily unsound. There are no relief columns. Even if there were, they couldn't reach us through Soviet lines. We're outnumbered 30-1. If we stay, we'll be annihilated. If we break out now, we might save 20,000 men. Schneider looked at the map, at the red arrows showing Soviet positions tightening around the city. Werner was right. Every tactical calculation said break out now. But tactics weren't the issue. Colonel Werner, I received a direct order from the Supreme Commander. That order is clear. We will hold Vitebsk. Sir, the discussion is over. Werner's face flushed. Then we're choosing to die for an order we know is wrong. Schneider's voice was quiet, controlled. We're choosing to follow orders. That's what soldiers do. Even suicidal orders. Who decides which orders are suicidal? Colonel, you, me. If every commander makes that judgment independently, we don't have an army. We have an armed mob. Another division commander spoke. Major General Hoffman, older, graying. General Schneider, I've served for 30 years. I understand military discipline, but discipline exists to make the army effective. This order makes us ineffective. It destroys 35,000 men for no strategic purpose. Surely that violates the principle behind the rule. Schneider closed his eyes, took a breath. When he spoke, his voice was tired. Gentlemen, I understand your concerns. I share them. But I received a direct order from the Führer. If I disobey that order, I'm not making a tactical decision. I'm committing mutiny. I'm placing my judgment above my supreme commanders. The supreme commander is wrong, Werner said. Perhaps, but he is still the supreme commander, and I am still a German officer bound by oath. We will hold Vitebsk. The meeting lasted 8 minutes. No one spoke as they left. Schneider remained alone with the map, staring at the red arrows, knowing what was coming. That night, he wrote a letter to his wife. The letter would be found on his body when he was captured. It read, "My dearest Anna, I am ordered to hold Vitebsk. This order will cost the lives of 35,000 men, myself included. I know the order is wrong. Every professional instinct tells me to break out while we still can. But I am a soldier. I have sworn an oath. That oath binds me to follow orders, even orders I disagree with. If I break that oath, what am I? If every officer follows only the orders he agrees with, what is the army? I don't know if I'm choosing duty or choosing death. I don't know if there's a difference anymore. Forgive me for what I'm about to do. Or fail to do. I'm not certain which. Your husband, Friedrich." The siege began the next morning. Soviet forces didn't assault directly. They simply tightened the noose, brought up heavy artillery, methodically destroyed the city block by block. German soldiers fought from rubble, then from basements, then from sewers. On June 27th, ammunition became critically low. Schneider ordered rationed fire, 1 shot per target. On June 28th, the last horses were slaughtered for food. The smell of cooking horse meat mixed with the smell of decomposing bodies. On June 29th, Soviet tanks entered the city center. Schneider, down to 8,000 effective soldiers, made his decision. He would break out without permission. He assembled his staff. "Gentlemen, I have followed orders for 6 days. We have held Vitebsk as commanded. But I will not preside over the complete destruction of this garrison. We're breaking out tonight, unauthorized, without permission." Werner looked at him. "Sir, you said following orders was everything. I was wrong, or I was right, and this is the exception. I don't know. But I won't watch 35,000 men die when some might still be saved." The breakout began at midnight. Soviet forces were waiting. They had anticipated exactly this, had positioned their best troops along every escape route, had artillery pre-registered on every possible exit, had tanks positioned to create killing zones. 8,000 men tried to break through Soviet lines. The fighting lasted 4 hours. Soviet infantry later described the roads as carpeted with German dead, bodies piled so deep in places that following waves had to climb over them. By dawn, fewer than 1,400 men had made it through. General Schneider was not among them. He was captured in the city center, wounded, surrounded by the bodies of his staff. When Soviet soldiers found him, he was still conscious, still holding the map he'd studied for 6 days. He asked them one question. "Did any of my men make it out?" The Soviet commander spoke German. "Some, perhaps 1,000. Schneider closed his eyes. "Then I saved 1,000 lives by disobeying orders and killed 7,000 by following them for too long." Those were his last words before he lost consciousness. 2,700 kilometers away, in a basement office in East Prussia, General Kurt Brenner received the report of Vitebsk's fall. He read it 3 times. Then he walked upstairs to the conference room, where Hitler was meeting with Albert Speer about armaments production. Brenner waited until the meeting ended. Speer left. Brenner entered. "My Führer, I have the final report from Vitebsk." Hitler looked up from production charts. "Vitebsk has fallen." "Yes, my Führer." The garrison held for 7 days against overwhelming odds. General Schneider attempted an unauthorized breakout on the final night. Approximately 1,400 men escaped. Schneider was captured. The rest of the garrison was destroyed. Hitler's face showed nothing for a moment. Then anger flooded in. Schneider attempted a breakout without permission. "Yes, my Führer." After 6 days of holding as ordered, when his position became untenable, that is desertion. That is cowardice. Schneider will be court-martialed. Brenner kept his voice level. General Schneider is now a Soviet prisoner. My Führer. Then the court-martial will proceed in absentia. His family will be arrested. His name will be stricken from the army rolls. Officers who disobey direct orders will learn the consequences. Brenner stood silent. He had been chief of the Army General Staff for 3 years, had argued with Hitler through 3 years of defeats, had watched every prediction come true, had been ignored every time. He was done. My Führer. Army Group Center has effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. 28 divisions have been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. Soviet forces have advanced 350 kilometers in 10 days. There is now a 400-kilometer gap in our defensive line. Hitler waved his hand. Exaggerated reports. Defeatist estimates. My Führer. These are confirmed figures from officers who panic, from commanders who lack offensive spirit. Brenner felt something break inside him. Something that had been cracking for 3 years finally shattered. My Führer. With respect, the problem is not offensive spirit. The problem is that we're defending with tactics that guarantee defeat. The fortress city policy has failed. Vitebsk is gone. Bobruisk is encircled. Orsha will fall within days. We must abandon this policy and establish mobile defenses, or we'll lose everything. Hitler stood. General Brenner, you are relieved of all duties effective immediately. You have proven yourself a defeatist and a pessimist. You are dismissed from your position. You are forbidden to wear your uniform. General Guderian will replace you. Brenner stood at attention. 34 years of service. 3 years of trying to save the army from strategic suicide. As you order. My Führer. He saluted, turned, walked out. In the hallway, an adjutant waited. Sir, I'm sorry. Don't be. I told the truth. The system can't tolerate truth. Better to know that now. Brenner returned to his office, removed his uniform, hung it in the closet, put on civilian clothes. He wrote one letter before leaving. To General Wagner, still nominally commanding Army Group Center. Ernst. I told Hitler the truth about the fortress policy. I was relieved immediately. This is the lesson. Truth-telling ends careers. Competence is punished. The only way to survive in this system is complicity. I'm done being complicit. You're trapped. You have 400,000 men depending on you, and a supreme commander who won't listen to reality. I don't envy you. I can't help you. All I can tell you is this. When following orders becomes murder, you have to choose. Follow orders and share responsibility for murder. Disobey orders and accept the consequences. There is no third option. I chose truth. I paid the price. At least I can live with myself. Can you? Kurt. The letter was never answered. Brenner spent the rest of the war under house arrest, forbidden to speak publicly, forbidden to wear uniform, forbidden to serve. His crime was telling the truth, 27 years later. In his suburban Virginia living room, Heinrich Müller told the interviewer about Brenner's fall. That was the turning point. Not for the battle was already lost, but for the system. When Brenner was relieved, every professional officer learned the lesson. Speaking truth ends your career. Competence is punished. Survival requires silence. So officers stopped arguing. They saluted. They obeyed. They implemented orders they knew were suicidal. and they told themselves they were doing their duty. That's when following orders became murder. The same day Vitebsk fell, Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Bobruisk. General Anton Hartmann commanded the garrison. 40,000 men. The city sat on a major road junction. Unlike Vitebsk, which the Soviets could bypass, Bobruisk actually mattered. The Soviets needed it. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky committed 2 entire armies to taking the city. The assault began July 1st with a bombardment that made the opening barrage of Bagration seem mild. 1,200 guns concentrated on a garrison, holding an 8-kilometer perimeter. The shelling lasted 6 hours. Buildings disintegrated. The earth itself seemed to liquefy. Hartmann sheltered in a reinforced bunker 3 stories underground. The concrete walls shook so violently he couldn't stand. Dust filled the air. The electric lights flickered and died. In the darkness, listening to the world ending above him, Hartmann thought about Vitebsk, about Schneider holding for 6 days, about Schneider's unauthorized breakout, about Schneider being court-martialed. When the barrage lifted, Hartmann sent an urgent message to Army Group Center headquarters. The message was simple: under massive assault, being annihilated, require immediate relief or permission to break out. The response came 2 hours later. It did not come from Army Group Center headquarters. It came directly from Hitler's headquarters, and it was signed personally by Hitler. Hartmann read it 3 times. Bobruisk will be held. It is a fortress city. Relief is being organized. General Hartmann will hold his position. Adolf Hitler, his chief of staff, Colonel Richter, read the message over his shoulder. Personal signature. Richter said, "From the Führer himself, I see that. Sir, Schneider held for 6 days and was court-martialed for breaking out. Now we have a direct personal order. If we break out unauthorized, it's not just disobedience, it's personal betrayal of the Supreme Commander." Hartmann looked at the map, looked at the red arrows showing Soviet forces closing in from all sides, looked at his garrison strength estimates. 40,000 men 3 days ago, 32,000 now. By tomorrow, maybe 25,000. The mathematics were simple. Every day they held, they lost 5,000 to 7,000 men. In 5 days, the garrison would be destroyed. If they broke out now, they might save 20,000. But the order was signed by Hitler personally. Hartmann was 48 years old, professional soldier, not political. He had never met Hitler, had seen him only in newsreels and photographs. But the man commanded Germany, the man commanded the armed forces, and the man had given him a direct personal order. "We hold," Hartmann said. Richter stared at him. "Sir, we'll be destroyed." "Yes, but we'll be destroyed following orders, not shot for disobeying them." "Is there a difference?" "There has to be. If there's no difference between following suicidal orders and disobeying them, then military discipline has no meaning. Orders have no meaning. The entire structure falls apart. The entire structure is already falling apart." "Sir," Hartmann had no answer to that. They held for 2 more days. Soviet tanks entered the city on July 3rd. The perimeter collapsed. Soviet infantry fought from building to building. The garrison fragmented into isolated pockets. Hartmann, in his bunker, down to 16,000 effective soldiers, made his decision. He would break out, unauthorized, without permission, in direct defiance of a personal order from Hitler. He assembled what remained of his staff. "Gentlemen, we're breaking out. I take full responsibility. If any of you survive, tell them I ordered it. Tell them you protested. Save yourselves." The breakout began at dawn. 16,000 men tried to fight their way through Soviet lines. Soviet forces had positioned their best troops on every escape route, had artillery pre-registered on every exit, had created interlocking fields of fire with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. The breakout became a slaughter. Soviet soldiers later described it as the worst killing they had witnessed in the entire war. German soldiers running through fields while artillery fell like rain. Bodies everywhere. Wounded men crawling. Officers shot while trying to rally their troops. The fighting lasted 3 hours. Of 16,000 men who attempted the breakout, approximately 7,000 made it through Soviet lines. General Hartmann led from the front. He was 48 years old, professional soldier. He had commanded troops in Poland, in France, in Russia. He believed in leading by example. He was killed by machine gun fire in the first hour. His last words, according to witnesses who survived, were addressed to his adjutant. "Tell them I followed orders for as long as I could. Tell them I only disobeyed when there was no other choice. Tell them I tried to save the men." He died before hearing the response. Senior Sergeant Dmitry Volkov's artillery unit was positioned along one of the breakout routes. He watched through binoculars as German soldiers emerged from the city, running, desperate, disorganized. "Fire mission," his observer team later called out. "Infantry in the open. Range 1,400 meters." Volkov called in the coordinates. Heard his battery commander acknowledge. Heard the guns fire. Watched the shells impact among the running figures. Bodies thrown into the air. Others disappearing in explosions. Survivors running. More shells falling. It wasn't combat. It was execution. Volkov had survived Leningrad, had learned to hate Germans for what they'd done to his city, to his family, to his country. But watching this, he felt sick. These weren't soldiers fighting. These were men dying. The barrage continued for 30 minutes. When it stopped, the field was carpeted with dead. Volkov climbed down from his observation post. Needed to mark Soviet advance positions. Standard procedure after an attack. He walked across the battlefield. Bodies everywhere. German soldiers. Most dead. Some wounded. Some still alive. Calling for medics who would never come. He found one body still holding a letter, unfinished, blood-stained. The letter was in German. Volkov read German, had learned it studying captured documents. "My dearest Maria, I write this knowing I may not survive. We are breaking out tonight, unauthorized, against orders, but remaining means certain death. The Führer himself ordered us to hold. But the Führer is not here. He does not see what we see. He does not know that holding means dying for nothing. I follow this order even though I know it will doom us. This is what duty requires. This is what my oath demands. Forgive me for what I am about to do, for following orders that make no sense, for leading men to their deaths because I was too much a soldier to refuse. I love you. I'm sorry. Anton." The signature was clear. General Anton Hartmann. Volkov stood holding the letter, looking at the field of corpses, at the city still burning behind them, at the evidence of everything this battle meant. He thought about the German family photograph in his pocket, thought about the letter in his hand, thought about how both sides were following orders. Both sides were doing their duty. Both sides were killing and dying because systems demanded it. He kept the letter. That evening, in his bivouac, he showed it to his observer team leader. "Why are you keeping these things?" "The photograph. The letter. Because," Volkov said, "when the war ends, people will say Germans were monsters. They'll say Soviets were heroes. They'll make it simple. But it's not simple. These men were soldiers following orders, just like us. They died following bad orders. We killed them following good orders. But orders are just orders. The men executing them are just men. I keep these things because I need to remember. We're all trapped in systems that make us killers. Some of us happen to be on the winning side. That's the only difference." Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel attended every daily conference at Hitler's headquarters. He was 62 years old, chief of the Armed Forces High Command. He had spent more time managing paperwork than commanding troops. But he understood military reality. After Bobruisk fell, after the reports came in of Hartmann's death and the massacre during the breakout, Keitel returned to his office. His adjutant found him there, staring at the wall. "Sir, are you all right?" Keitel didn't answer immediately. Then, "How many men were in the Bobruisk garrison?" 40,000. "Sir, 7,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. 33,000 casualties. For what strategic purpose?" The adjutant had no answer. "Sir, You signed the order designating Bobruisk a fortress city. I know what I signed. Did you believe it would work? Keitel looked at his adjutant. Younger man, 30 years old, still believed orders made sense. No. I knew the fortress city policy was strategically unsound, tactically suicidal. I knew it when I signed the orders. Then why did you sign them? Sir, because the Führer ordered it. Because I am a soldier. Because that is what military discipline requires, even when the orders are wrong, especially when the orders are wrong. If officers only follow orders they agree with, we don't have an army. We have anarchy. The adjutant looked uncomfortable. Sir, with respect, doesn't that make us responsible for what happens? Keitel stood, walked to the window, looked out at the Bavarian Alps. Yes, he said quietly. It does. Then how do we justify it? We don't. We simply follow orders and accept the consequences. That's what duty means. The adjutant left. Keitel remained at the window, thinking about Vitebsk, about Bobruisk, about the fortress cities still waiting to fall, about the 100,000 men he had signed orders condemning to death. He was a professional soldier. He had served for 40 years. He believed in duty, in discipline, in the chain of command. He also knew he was facilitating murder. Both things were true. He didn't know how to reconcile them, so he simply continued. Attended conferences, took notes, signed orders, and told himself he was doing his duty. Years later, at Nuremberg, when the prosecutors asked him how he could sign orders knowing they would lead to mass death, Keitel gave the answer he had given himself for years. I was following orders. The judges didn't accept it. Heinrich Müller, watching the trial footage in 1973, understood something fundamental. Keitel wasn't lying. He really believed he was just following orders. That's what makes it so dangerous. Good men convincing themselves that obedience absolves responsibility. That duty means never questioning orders. Keitel signed papers that killed 100,000 men, then told himself he was just doing his job. That's not innocence. That's complicity dressed as professionalism. July 4th, 1944. Field Marshal Walter Koch arrived at Army Group Center headquarters to assume command. He was 58 years old, experienced, competent, known as Hitler's fireman because he had stabilized collapsing fronts before. He walked into the operations room and studied the map. Army Group Center had consisted of 47 divisions. 31 were now destroyed or combat ineffective. Soviet forces had advanced 350 kilometers in 11 days. The gap in the German defensive line was 400 kilometers wide. Koch turned to the Chief of Staff. What reserves do I have? None. Sir, everything was committed, trying to stop the breakthrough. What about the panzer divisions promised by the Führer? Still in transit. Earliest arrival in 5 days. Probably longer. Koch studied the map. Did the mathematics in his head? By the time reserves arrived, Soviet forces would be another 100 kilometers west. There was no stopping this, only slowing it. Prepare my aircraft. I'm flying to Führer headquarters. Sir, I need permission to establish a new defensive line. Along the Vistula River, it's the only position we can hold. The flight to Berghof took 4 hours. Koch spent the flight reviewing casualty figures, trying to find words that would make Hitler understand reality. He failed. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. Koch presented his assessment, showed the maps, explained the situation. My Führer, Army Group Center no longer exists as a cohesive fighting force. We must establish a new defensive line along the Vistula River. This requires abandoning Belorussia and most of Lithuania. But it's the only way to create a stable front. Hitler's response was immediate. No, every meter of ground will be contested. The Soviet advance will be stopped through counterattacks. My Führer, counterattacks require forces I don't have. The panzer divisions will arrive shortly. 15 divisions are being transferred from other fronts. You will stop the Soviet advance. Then you will retake Minsk. Koch had commanded troops for 35 years. He knew when an order was impossible. He also knew better than to argue directly with Hitler. As you order, my Führer. He saluted and left. On the flight back, his chief of staff asked the question, "Sir, what do we do?" Koch looked at the map spread across his lap. "We conduct a fighting retreat. We delay the Soviets where possible. We preserve what forces remain. We ignore the Führer's orders when necessary, and follow them when we can. That's disobeying direct orders." "Sir." "Yes, it is. Court-martial me after the war, if we survive that long." Koch understood something that Schneider and Hartmann had learned too late. In a system that demanded obedience to suicidal orders, survival required calculated disobedience. The question wasn't whether to disobey. The question was how to disobey quietly enough to save lives without destroying the Army's command structure completely. Koch chose to disobey quietly. He would save what he could, lose what he must, and hope that preserving some portion of Army Group Center was better than presiding over its total annihilation. It was an impossible position. He accepted it because someone had to. And unlike Schneider, who followed orders until it was too late, unlike Hartmann, who waited too long to disobey, unlike Brenner, who told the truth and was destroyed, Koch understood that survival in a broken system required compromise. Not compromise with evil, compromise with reality. He would follow orders that made sense, ignore orders that guaranteed death, and accept responsibility for choosing which was which. Army Group Center was dead, but Koch would save the fragments. That was all anyone could do. Lieutenant Heinrich Müller reached what remained of German lines on July 15th. The line was generous terminology. It was a collection of hastily dug trenches manned by stragglers, rear echelon troops, and survivors like himself. No continuous front, no coordinated defense, just clusters of men with rifles trying to slow down an army. A replacement battalion was forming at Grodno. Officers with clipboards processed survivors, assigned them to new units, tried to create combat formations from fragments. Muller stood in line with 10 men, all that remained of his platoon of 38. The processing officer was a major, late 50s, looked exhausted. Name: Muller. Heinrich. First Lieutenant. Unit: 31st Infantry Division. 3rd Battalion. The major checked his roster, found no 31st Infantry Division. It no longer existed. Age: 22. The major looked up, studied Muller's face. The scars, the eyes that had seen too much. Experience: 3 years Eastern Front, Stalingrad. 2 wounds. 3 weeks fighting withdrawal from Vitebsk. The major made a notation. You're now a company commander. Report to Colonel Bauer, 2nd Battalion, Grodno Defense Regiment. Sir, I've never commanded a company. You have now. Dismissed. Muller found 2nd Battalion headquarters in what had been a schoolhouse. Colonel Bauer was there, 53 years old. Career officer who had spent 2 years in a training command before being thrown into this disaster. Lieutenant Müller, you're taking C Company. Yes, sir. What's the company strength? 63 men, most are over 40, pulled from supply companies, transportation units, administrative positions. They have rifles but no heavy weapons, no machine guns, no anti-tank capabilities, no artillery support. What's their combat experience? Minimal. Some have seen fighting, most haven't. You'll train them as best you can and be ready to move into defensive positions by tomorrow. Muller found C Company in a field behind the schoolhouse, 63 men sitting in groups, looking lost. He studied them. Old men, mostly, men who should have been home with families. Farmers, factory workers, clerks, men who joined the army to drive trucks or file paperwork or cook meals. Now they were infantry. He assembled them. They stood in ragged formation. I'm Lieutenant Müller. I'm your new company commander. I won't lie to you. Most of you have never been in combat. I have. For 3 years. Here's what I can promise you. I'll try to keep you alive. I'll try to bring you home. That's all anyone can promise in this situation. An older soldier spoke up. Maybe 52, gray hair, lined face. Sir, will we win? Muller looked at him. At all of them. at men who deserved an honest answer. No, we won't win. The Eastern Front is collapsing. Army Group Center is destroyed. We're conducting a fighting retreat. Our job is to slow down the Soviet advance and preserve what forces remain. Then why are we fighting? Because someone has to. Because if we don't, the Soviets reach Germany faster. Because every day we delay them is another day for civilians to evacuate. Because we're soldiers, and this is what soldiers do. It wasn't inspiring. It wasn't heroic. It was true. The men seemed to accept that. That evening, Muller sat in an abandoned classroom and wrote in his journal, July 15th, 1944. Karl, I command men now, 63 of them, old men who've never seen combat. I'm 22 years old, and I'm responsible for their lives. I think about Schneider at Vitebsk. He followed orders for 6 days, sacrificed 35,000 men to obedience, then broke out without permission and saved 1,400. I think about Hartmann at Bobruisk. Followed orders until it was too late. Died heroically executing suicidal commands. I think about Koch, fighting retreat, disobeying Hitler's hold orders quietly, saving what he can through calculated disobedience. 3 choices, 3 different approaches to the same problem. Follow orders and watch men die uselessly. Disobey orders and face court-martial. Disobey quietly and hope you survive long enough for it to matter. I don't know which is right. I don't know if any of them are right. All I know is that in 2 days, I'll lead 63 old men into combat against an enemy that outnumbers us 20-1. And I'll have to make choices about who lives and who dies. Am I choosing tactics, or am I choosing murder? Where does the line fall between military necessity and moral responsibility? I don't know, but I have to choose anyway. Your brother, Heinrich. C Company moved into defensive positions on July 17th. They were assigned to hold a village called Krinki. No strategic value, just another delay position. Muller walked the defenses with his platoon leaders, 3 sergeants, all pulled from non-combat positions. None had ever directed defensive fires. He showed them how to set up interlocking fields of fire, how to prepare fallback positions, how to recognize the sound of incoming artillery. They learned quickly. Fear was an excellent teacher. The village had about 200 civilians still in residence. Old people mostly, too old or too sick to evacuate. One of them, a woman in her 70s, brought Muller bread. Will you hold the village? She asked in Polish-accented German. No, we'll slow them down. Then we'll withdraw. The Soviets will come. Yes. What will they do to us? Muller had seen what happened to civilians caught between armies, had seen bodies in ditches, had seen villages burned. I don't know. Hide if you can. Don't resist. Wait for it to be over. It was inadequate advice, but it was all he had. Soviet forces arrived the next morning. Not a full assault. Probing attacks. Testing the defenses. Muller's company had 63 rifles, 200 rounds per man. That was all. The first attack came at dawn. Soviet infantry, perhaps 200 men, supported by 3 tanks. Muller ordered his men to hold fire until the enemy was within 200 meters. Maximum effect from limited ammunition. The Soviets advanced across open ground. Professional, using cover, moving by squads. At 200 meters, Muller gave the order, fire. 63 rifles opened up simultaneously. Soviet soldiers dropped. Others took cover, returned fire. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. When the Soviets withdrew, Muller counted casualties. 3 of his men wounded, none killed. Perhaps 20 Soviet casualties. It was a tactical victory. It was also meaningless. The Soviets would probe again. And again. Eventually, they'd commit real forces. Tanks, artillery, infantry in battalion strength. And C Company would be destroyed. The question was when to withdraw. Too early, and he failed his mission. Too late, and everyone died. Schneider had waited too long. Hartmann had waited too long. Muller decided he wouldn't. The second attack came that afternoon. Stronger, maybe 500 infantry, 6 tanks, Artillery preparation. Mueller knew the mathematics. His company couldn't stop this. He gave the order to withdraw. They fell back to prepared positions 3 kilometers west. Lost 2 men covering the retreat. Saved 61. No one had given him permission to withdraw. He just did it. That evening, Colonel Bauer found him. Lieutenant Mueller, you withdrew from Krinky without orders. Yes, sir. We were about to be overrun. Holding would have meant complete destruction. Withdrawing preserved the company. Bauer stared at him. You made a tactical decision to disobey standing orders. Yes, sir. Do you understand that's grounds for court-martial? Yes, sir. Will you court-martial me? Bauer was silent for a long moment. No, you made the right call. But officially, I'm reprimanding you for withdrawing prematurely. Officially, you're ordered to hold next time. Understood. Yes, sir. Unofficially, use your judgment. We're trying to save the army, not sacrifice it. Just make sure I can defend your decisions if anyone asks. Mueller understood. The system required the appearance of obedience, while reality required calculated disobedience. Everyone was learning to navigate the gap between orders and survival. Over the next 2 weeks, C Company fought 3 more delaying actions. Mueller withdrew twice without permission, held once when ordered, lost 30 men total, saved 31. Each time, he made calculations, military necessity versus orders, saving lives versus following commands. Each time, he wondered if he was making tactical decisions or just choosing which men would die. One evening, after a particularly difficult engagement, where he had ordered a withdrawal that saved 15 men but abandoned 5 wounded who couldn't be moved, Mueller sat alone in a ruined farmhouse and stared at his hands. They were shaking. He had ordered men to leave their wounded comrades behind. The wounded would be captured or killed. He had made that calculation. Saved 15 more. Abandoned WWII. Was that the right choice? Was there a right choice? A sergeant found him there. Young man. Maybe 25. One of the few with combat experience. Sir, you made the right call. We couldn't carry them and fight our way out. If we'd stayed, we'd all be dead. Mueller looked at him. How do you know it was the right call? Because I'm alive to have this conversation. Because 15 other men are alive. The sergeant paused. Sir, with respect, this is what command is. You make choices. Some men live, some men die. You can't save everyone. The only question is whether you save anyone. Mueller nodded, but the shaking didn't stop. That night he wrote, July 28th, 1944. Carl, today I ordered men to abandon their wounded comrades. Saved 15 men. Left 5 to die or be captured. I made calculations. Military necessity. Tactical reality. Force preservation. All the words we use to make murder sound professional. But I chose. I looked at wounded men and decided they were acceptable losses. I looked at other men and decided they were worth saving. How do I know I chose correctly? How does anyone know? Schneider made choices. Hartmann made choices. Koch makes choices. I make choices. We all tell ourselves we're doing our duty. We're following orders or disobeying them for good reasons. But men die either way, and we made the decisions that killed them. Where does responsibility end? When does following orders become murder? When does disobeying orders become murder? I don't know anymore. Your brother, Heinrich. On August 1st, Soviet artillery hit their position during withdrawal. Mueller was wounded, shrapnel in his shoulder and leg. Not life-threatening, but enough to evacuate him. He woke in a field hospital. Tense. Hundreds of wounded. Smell of blood and antiseptic and death. A doctor found him. Young, maybe 30, eyes red from exhaustion. You'll live, the doctor said. Clean wounds. You'll recover. How long? 6 weeks minimum. Probably longer. You're being evacuated to Germany. Mueller felt relief and shame in equal measure. Relief that he was leaving the front. Shame that he was leaving while his men stayed. My company. Is someone else's problem now? You did your part. The doctor moved to the next patient. Mueller lay on the cot and stared at the tent ceiling. He had commanded for 2 weeks, lost 30 men, saved 31, disobeyed orders twice, followed orders once, led men to die because military necessity demanded it, saved men by disobeying because conscience demanded it. Was he a good officer? A bad officer? A survivor? A coward? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had made choices, and those choices had consequences, and men were dead because of them. While Mueller lay recovering in the field hospital through late July and early August, news reached him of events that would reshape the entire German command structure. Other wounded officers brought stories, whispered conversations in the dark. Something had happened on July 20th, something that changed everything. An assassination attempt, a bomb in Hitler's headquarters. The Führer had survived. The conspirators had been arrested. Hundreds of officers implicated, thousands arrested. Executions, purges, the old guard being destroyed. One officer, a major who had lost both legs, told Mueller the details in the middle of the night when neither of them could sleep. July 20th, he said, while we were fighting in Belarusia, while Koch was conducting his retreat, while the whole Eastern Front was collapsing, a group of officers tried to kill Hitler, planted a bomb in a conference room. The major paused. It failed. Hitler survived. Minor injuries. And then the purge. Anyone who ever questioned his decisions, anyone who ever argued for retreat, anyone who ever suggested alternative strategies, all suspect, all arrested. 7,000 arrests, 5,000 executions, officers hanged with piano wire, families arrested, names stricken from records. Mueller listened in the darkness, understanding something fundamental. Before July 20th, professionals could argue, could present alternatives, could debate strategy. After July 20th, all of that is treason. The major's voice was bitter. Questioning orders became conspiracy. Professional military judgment became betrayal. Hitler convinced himself the defeats weren't his fault, weren't about Soviet strength or German weakness. It was betrayal. Traitors in the officer corps sabotaging his orders. Defeatists spreading pessimism. So he destroyed them. Destroyed what was left of the professional military. Now the only loyal officer is the one who never questions, never argues, never thinks. Mueller understood. The system had completed its transformation. Obedience was the only virtue. Silence was the only survival strategy. Truth was death. That night, Mueller wrote what would be his last wartime journal entry, August 1st, 1944. Carl, I'm being evacuated. Wounded. Not seriously. I'll live. I commanded men for 2 weeks. Made decisions about who would live and die. Followed some orders. Disobeyed others. I saved 31 men. Lost 30. I don't know if I made the right choices. I don't know if there were right choices. All I know is that I'm complicit now. In everything. I can't say I was just following orders because I didn't always follow orders. I made choices. Those choices killed people. And now I learn that the system has completed its evolution. After July 20th, after the assassination attempt, questioning orders became treason. The purge has destroyed what remained of the professional officer corps. Anyone who ever argued with Hitler, anyone who ever suggested alternatives, all arrested, all executed. The message is clear. Silence is survival. Obedience is safety. Truth is death. I'm going home to Germany, back to a country that's losing the war, back to a system that's destroying itself through ideology and obedience. I don't know what I'm fighting for anymore. I don't know if I ever did, but I'm alive. 31 men are alive because I chose to disobey. 30 men are dead because I chose to follow orders or because I chose wrong about when to disobey. I'll carry that forever. Your brother, Heinrich. Mueller returned to Germany in September 1944, spent 2 months recovering. The wounds healed, the scars remained. By November, he was reassigned, not to the Eastern Front, to the Western Front. The Allies were approaching the German border. Everyone was needed, but Mueller's combat days were effectively over. His wounds had left him with limited mobility in his left arm. He was assigned to a training battalion, teaching new recruits basic infantry tactics. Most of his students were 16 or 17 years old. Children. Really. Called up because Germany was running out of men, Muller taught them how to dig trenches, how to recognize aircraft, how to survive artillery barrages. He didn't tell them they were going to die. He didn't have to. They could see it in his face. One student, a boy named Peter, 16 years old, asked him after class, "Sir, will we win the war?" Muller looked at him, at all of them, at children about to be fed into a machine that would destroy them. He should have lied, should have given them hope, should have followed the script about final victory and secret weapons and the Führer's genius. Instead, he told the truth. No, we've already lost. The question now is how long it takes to end. Your job is to survive until it does. The next day, Muller was called to the battalion commander's office. "Lieutenant Mueller, I've received reports that you're spreading defeatism among the recruits." "Sir, I'm telling them the truth. The truth is what the Führer says it is. The truth is that Germany will achieve final victory. That is what you will teach." Muller stood at attention. "Sir, these boys are going to die. They deserve to know why. They're going to die defending Germany. That's all they need to know. You're relieved of teaching duties. You'll be assigned to administrative work until further notice." Muller saluted, left the office. He spent the rest of the war filing paperwork in a basement office, processing casualty reports, reading names of soldiers killed in action. Thousands of names, tens of thousands, young men, old men, officers who followed orders, officers who disobeyed them, all dead, all part of a system that valued obedience over survival. In April 1945, as Soviet forces approached Berlin, Muller's unit was dissolved. He was given a rifle and ordered to join the defense of the city. He deserted instead, found civilian clothes, hid in a basement, waited for the war to end. It took 3 weeks. When Soviet forces occupied his sector, he surrendered, spent 6 months in a POW camp, was released when authorities determined he had no war crimes on his record. He returned to his hometown to find it half destroyed. His family had survived. His mother, his younger brother Karl, who had been drafted in late 1944, wounded, and sent home. Karl was 17 years old, missing his left leg below the knee, missing something else too. The spark, the life, whatever made him more than just flesh and bone. They sat together that first night, said nothing for a long time. Finally, Karl spoke. "Why did we fight? What was it for?" Muller had no answer. Heinrich Muller didn't talk about the war for 25 years. He became a teacher, history, high school, in a small town in Northern Virginia where no one knew his past. He married, had 2 children, built a quiet life, but he still had the journal, still had the letters he'd written to Karl but never sent, still had the memories. In 1970, his wife found him in his study, crying, the journal open on his desk. "Heinrich, what's wrong?" "I was reading about Vitebsk, about Schneider, about how he followed orders for 6 days, how 35,000 men died because one man at Berghof said they should. And I was remembering my company, how I disobeyed orders twice, how 30 men died anyway, how I tell myself I saved 31 but I killed 30. I thought coming to America would let me escape it. But I can't, because I was part of it. I followed orders that killed people. I gave orders that killed people. I made decisions that seemed right at the time, but men died anyway. Where does responsibility end?" His wife held him, had no answer. 3 years later, when PBS contacted him about an interview for their documentary on the Eastern Front, he initially refused. She convinced him to do it. "Maybe you need to tell it. Maybe someone needs to hear it." So he agreed. The interviewer came to his home. Young man, long hair, probably opposed the Vietnam War, probably thought he understood the moral complexity of following orders in an immoral system. He didn't, not yet, but maybe he would. Muller told his story. Not all of it. The interview was only 2 hours, but he told the important parts. About Schneider and Vitebsk, about Hartmann and Bobruisk, about Brenner telling the truth and being destroyed for it, about his own company, his own choices, his own guilt. The interviewer asked the question Mueller had been waiting for. Mr. Mueller, you've talked about officers who followed orders and officers who disobeyed them. You've talked about systems that punished truth. But what about personal responsibility? At what point does following orders become inexcusable? Mueller took off his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on. I've been thinking about that question for 29 years. I watched Keitel hang at Nuremberg, watched him say I was following orders, and I felt nothing because I thought he was different from me. But he wasn't. Not really. He signed orders that killed hundreds of thousands. I executed orders that killed dozens. We both said we were following orders. We both made choices about which orders to follow and which to question. The difference was rank and luck. He was Field Marshal. I was lieutenant. He signed papers. I led men into combat. But we both made choices. We both bear responsibility for those choices. I saved 31 men by disobeying orders. I killed 30 by following orders or by making wrong decisions about when to disobey. Those 31 men probably think I was a good officer. The families of those 30 men might disagree, and I live with both. Every day. I teach history to children, and I wonder, am I teaching them to think critically or to obey authority? Because both are necessary. Both are dangerous. The lesson of Operation Bagration isn't that Germans were evil or that Hitler was a monster. Those things are true, but they're not the lesson. The lesson is that good men can become complicit in evil through obedience, through professionalism, through duty, through all the virtues we're taught to value. Schneider was an excellent officer who executed terrible orders excellently. Hartmann died heroically following suicidal commands. Keitel managed paperwork efficiently while facilitating mass murder. I saved some men and killed others and told myself I was doing my best in a bad situation. We were all complicit. All of us who served, all of us who followed orders, all of us who made choices and told ourselves we had no choice. That's the truth no one wants to hear. Not the Germans who lived through it. Not the Americans who defeated us. Not anyone. But it's true. And if we don't understand it, if we don't teach it, if we pretend that only monsters commit atrocities while good men are always innocent, then we guarantee it happens again. Because the next war will have its own Schneiders and Hartmanns and Keitels and Mullers. Good men following orders, making choices, telling themselves they're doing their duty, and those men need to understand. Duty without conscience is not honor. Following orders is not absolution. Being a good soldier in an evil cause does not make you innocent. I learned that at Vitebsk, at Bobruisk, in a village called Krinky, where I led old men to die for a cause that was already lost. I hope you never have to learn it. But if you do, I hope you remember this. The moment you realize the orders are wrong, you have 3 choices. Follow them and share responsibility for what happens. Disobey and accept the consequences. Or disobey quietly and hope you survive long enough for it to matter. I chose all 3 at different times. I'm not proud of any of them. But I made choices. I didn't hide behind orders. I didn't pretend I had no agency. That's all any soldier can do. Make choices. Accept responsibility. Live with the consequences. And hope that's enough. The interviewer was silent for a long moment. Do you think it's enough? Do you think you've made peace with what you did? Mueller looked at the journal on his desk, at the letters to his brother, at the record of choices made and lives lost. No, he said. I don't think it's enough. I don't think I'll ever make peace with it. But I tell my story anyway. I teach anyway. I try anyway. Because the alternative is silence. And silence is how systems like that survive. Silence is how good men convince themselves that obedience is virtue. Silence is how we guarantee it happens again. So I speak. I remember. I teach. It's not redemption. It's not absolution. But it's all I have. The interview aired in late 1973. Mueller watched it with his family. His wife, his children, his brother Karl, who rarely spoke about the war. When it ended, Karl was crying. Heinrich, I never knew. I never knew you went through all that. You went through worse. You were just 17, but I didn't have to make choices. I was just a soldier. I followed orders. You were an officer. You had to decide. Muller looked at his brother, at the empty pant leg, at the toll the war had taken. We all made choices. Karl, even if the choice was just to keep fighting when we knew it was hopeless, even if the choice was just to follow orders we knew were wrong, we're all responsible. All of us who served, all of us who participated. The question isn't whether we bear responsibility. The question is what we do with it. That night, Muller opened his journal one final time, added one last entry. November 1973. Karl, I finally told our story. The story I wrote to you during the war but never sent. I thought telling it would bring peace. It didn't. But maybe peace isn't the point. Maybe the point is remembering. Maybe the point is making sure people understand how good men become complicit in evil. Not through malice, not through cruelty, not through being monsters, through duty, through obedience, through professionalism, through following orders and telling ourselves we have no choice. That's the lesson of Operation Bagration. That's the lesson of Vitebsk and Bobruisk and every fortress city that fell. That's the lesson of every officer who followed suicidal orders and every soldier who died executing them. Ideology cannot defeat artillery. Willpower cannot stop tanks. Orders cannot change reality. But men can choose, can question, can think. And when they stop choosing, when they stop questioning, when they stop thinking, when they hide behind orders and duty and discipline, that's when systems like ours destroy themselves. That's when good men become killers. I was a killer. Karl, I followed orders. I gave orders. Men died because of choices I made. I tell this story so maybe, somewhere, someone facing similar choices will remember, will question, will think, will understand that following orders is not virtue when the orders are evil, that duty without conscience is not honor, that obedience is not absolution. I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if anything is enough. But I tried. I remembered. I spoke. That's all any of us can do. Your brother, Heinrich. He closed the journal, put it back on the shelf. Tomorrow, he would teach history to high school students, would tell them about World War II, about Eastern Front, about military strategy and political ideology and the consequences of totalitarianism. And if they asked him about Operation Bagration, about why Germany lost, about what happened to the officers who followed Hitler's orders, he would tell them the truth, not the simple truth, not the comfortable truth, the real truth, that good men participated in evil, that duty became murder, that obedience destroyed an army, and that every one of them, from the Field Marshal, who signed papers to the lieutenant, who led men to die, bore responsibility for their choices. Because in the end, everyone makes choices, and everyone lives with consequences. That was what Heinrich Müller learned in the summer of 1944, in the ruins of Army Group Center, in the fortress, cities that fell, and the villages that burned, and the fields where men died following orders they knew were wrong. That was what he taught for the rest of his life, and that was what he hoped would be remembered. Not Hitler's speeches about willpower and final victory, not the statistics of divisions destroyed and casualties inflicted, but the simple truth that men choose, that choices matter, that responsibility cannot be escaped through obedience, that when ideology demands suicide and duty demands murder, and orders demand the impossible, the only moral choice is to question, to think, to resist, to refuse, even if the cost is everything, especially if the cost is everything, because some things are worth more than survival. Some things are worth more than duty. Some things are worth more than following orders, like conscience, like humanity, like the ability to look in the mirror and recognize yourself. Heinrich Müller had lost many things in the war: comrades, innocence, the certainty that following orders made you righteous. But he had kept one thing, the willingness to remember, to question, to teach, to ensure that the lesson of Operation Bagration, that obedience to evil is not virtue, would not be forgotten. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't absolution. But it was something, and sometimes something is enough. The war had ended 30 years ago. The men who fought it were growing old. The generation that remembered was disappearing. Soon there would be no one left who could say, "I was there. I saw. I participated. I chose." And in the choosing, I learned what duty means when systems fail, what honor means when orders are evil, what responsibility means when everyone says they were just following commands. That knowledge was precious. That knowledge was dangerous. That knowledge had to be preserved. So Mueller taught, day after day, year after year. He told students about Operation Bagration, about the fortress cities, about the officers who followed orders and the officers who disobeyed them, about the cost of both choices. He told them about Schneider, who followed orders until it was too late and died dishonored, about Hartmann, who died heroically executing suicidal commands, about Brenner, who told the truth and was destroyed, about Koch, who disobeyed quietly and saved what he could, about a young lieutenant who commanded for 2 weeks and learned that there are no good choices in evil systems, only choices with different costs. And he told them about Keitel, about the Field Marshal, who signed papers that killed hundreds of thousands and said at Nuremberg, "I was following orders," about how the judges rejected that defense, about how Keitel was hanged, about how that answer, that simple phrase, had echoed through history as both explanation and condemnation. "I was following orders," the phrase that every soldier knows, the phrase that every officer uses, the phrase that absolves nothing and explains everything. Mueller would stand in front of his classroom and ask, "When does following orders become murder? When does duty become complicity? When does professionalism become evil?" The students never had good answers. Neither did he. But asking the question was the point, understanding that the question exists, understanding that men make choices even when they pretend they don't, understanding that responsibility cannot be evaded through obedience. That was the lesson. That was what had to be remembered. As the 1970s continued, as America dealt with its own questions about following orders, about military conduct, about the responsibilities of soldiers in unjust wars, Mueller's story found an audience, veterans who had faced their own moral dilemmas, young people questioning authority, anyone who wondered, what would I do? Would I follow orders I knew were wrong? Would I disobey and face the consequences? Would I try to find some middle path between obedience and conscience? Mueller's answer was always the same. I don't know what you would do. I only know what I did, and I know that I bear responsibility for it. Not Hitler, not the system, not the circumstances. Me. I made choices. Those choices had consequences. Men died. I carry that. But he also carried something else. The certainty that speaking truth was better than silence, that remembering was better than forgetting, that teaching the next generation about the dangers of blind obedience was better than letting them learn through experience. In his final years of teaching, before retirement, Mueller developed a unit on Operation Bagration. He would spend 2 weeks walking students through the entire campaign, the strategic situation, the fortress city policy, the individual stories of Schneider and Hartmann and Brenner and Koch, and his own story. The students were always most interested in his story. In the personal element, what was it like? How did you decide? Were you scared? Yes. He would tell them, I was scared. Scared of dying. Scared of making wrong choices. Scared of being the officer who got his men killed for nothing. But fear doesn't absolve responsibility. Fear doesn't make choices for you. You still have to decide. He would show them his journal, the yellowed pages, the cramped handwriting, the letters to Carl that were never sent. This is what it looked like when a system destroyed itself through ideology and obedience. These are the words of a young man trying to understand what duty meant when orders became suicidal, trying to figure out when disobedience became the only moral choice. The students would read excerpts, would see the progression from belief to doubt to understanding, would see how a soldier learned that following orders was not always virtue. Some students got it, some didn't. That was fine. The point wasn't that everyone would understand. The point was that everyone would know the question existed, would know that soldiers face moral choices, would know that duty and conscience sometimes conflict, would know that claiming to have followed orders is not exoneration. Years later, some of those students would write to him, would tell him how his lessons had affected them, how they had faced their own moral dilemmas, different in specifics, but similar in structure, how they had remembered his words. You always have a choice. The system wants you to believe you don't. But you do, and you bear responsibility for the choice you make. One student, who became an officer in the U.S. Army, wrote, "Sir, I faced a situation where I was ordered to do something I believed was wrong. I remembered your lessons. I refused the order. I was disciplined, but I can live with myself. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes that's all that matters." Mueller kept that letter, put it with his journal, evidence that the lesson had been learned, that the story had mattered, that speaking had been worth the cost. He died in 1997, at the age of 75. His funeral was small: family, former students, a few fellow veterans who had survived the Eastern Front. At the service, Carl spoke. He rarely spoke in public, but this was important. My brother carried the war with him every day of his life. He carried the guilt of choices made, of men lost, of orders followed and orders disobeyed. He never found peace with it, but he never stopped trying to ensure others wouldn't have to learn the same lessons through blood. He taught that duty without conscience is not honor, that following orders is not virtue when the orders are evil, that every soldier, every officer, every human being faces moral choices, and hiding behind authority or systems or circumstances doesn't absolve us of responsibility. That was his lesson. That was his gift, that we all choose, that we all bear the consequences, that obedience to evil is not virtue. Carl paused, looked at the small gathering, then added, "He would want me to tell you one more thing. The lesson of Operation Bagration isn't just about World War II, isn't just about Germany and Hitler and fortress cities. It's about any system that punishes truth and rewards blind obedience. It's about any authority that demands you surrender your conscience. It's about any moment when you're told that following orders is all that matters. And the lesson is, that's when you question. That's when you think. That's when you remember that you're a human being with moral agency, not just a cog in a machine." My brother never forgot that. Never let anyone forget that. And neither should we. The funeral ended. The mourners dispersed, but the lesson remained, preserved in the students he taught, in the journal he kept, in the story he told, the story of how good men became complicit in evil through obedience, how professional soldiers facilitated murder through following orders, how an entire army was destroyed because the system valued ideology over reality, loyalty over truth, obedience over conscience, and how one young lieutenant learned, at the cost of 30 lives, that duty means more than following orders, that honor means more than blind obedience, that being a good soldier requires the courage to question, to think, to refuse. That lesson, written in blood across the fields of Belarusia in the summer of 1944, had been passed down, from Mueller to his students, from his students to their children, from one generation to the next, the lesson that would never be fully learned, because each generation would have to learn it again. But at least the warning had been given. At least the story had been told. At least someone had stood up and said, "I was there. I participated. I chose. And I bear responsibility." That was enough. Not redemption, not absolution, but enough. Because the alternative, silence, was unacceptable. The alternative, forgetting, was unconscionable. The alternative, pretending that good men never face moral choices, that following orders is always right, that systems never fail, was a lie. And Mueller had spent his life refusing to lie, refusing to let anyone forget, refusing to let the story die. So the story lived, passed from mouth to ear, from page to mind, from one troubled conscience to another. The story of Operation Bagration, the story of how Hitler's ideology killed an army, the story of how following orders became murder, the story of how men chose and what those choices cost. That story would outlive them all, would outlive the war, would outlive the generation that fought it, because the lesson was eternal. The lesson was necessary. The lesson was this, that in the end, we all choose. We all bear responsibility, and obedience to evil is not virtue. That was what Hitler said when the Soviets launched Operation Bagration. Hold, fight, no retreat. Fortress cities will stand. Relief is coming. Victory through willpower. Commanders who retreat are defeatists. And that was why Germany lost the war. Not because the Soviets were stronger, though they were. Not because German soldiers weren't brave, though many weren't. But because the system valued obedience over reality, ideology over tactics, loyalty over truth. And when you build a system like that, when you punish truth-tellers and reward yes-men, when you court-martial officers for saving lives and promote officers for following suicidal orders, you don't get an army, you get a suicide pact. You get Operation Bagration. You get 350,000 casualties in 6 weeks. You get fortress cities falling one by one. You get an entire front collapsing. You get defeat. Inevitable. Complete. Self-inflicted. That was the lesson. And Heinrich Müller spent 50 years making sure no one forgot it.